The meeting hall doors stood closed against the evening. Marcus Brennan filled the entrance, shoulders broad as the doorframe, sweat gleaming on his brow despite the hour. 3 women stood before him on the dusty street, account ledgers and papers clutched in their hands. "This is men's business," he said. His voice carried iron certainty across the settlement's main thoroughfare. "Hurry, you could bide." Behind him, lamplight spilled from the hall's interior. 20 men's voices rose and fell in debate, discussing water allocation, well maintenance, rationing schedules, the same arguments they'd had for 3 weeks running. Outside, the women waited in gathering dusk. Patricia Sawyer stood at the back of the small group, a leather-bound notebook pressed against her chest. She was 48, widowed 6 years, her dark hair streaked with silver and pinned back from a face that showed neither anger nor surprise. She'd tried this twice before. The answer was always the same. "We've prepared allocation proposals," Martha Henderson said, holding out her ledger. "The rationing system isn't working fairly." Marcus didn't look at the papers. "The council will consider all matters appropriately. You ladies should tend to your homes." Patricia's gaze drifted past him to the men inside. Crowded around rough-hewn tables, maps spread before them showing the settlement's 6 wells. 5 were already running low. The 6th would fail within weeks. She could see it in the cottonwood trees lining the street, their leaves curling tight against the heat, branches turning brittle in July's relentless sun. She'd seen drought before. This was only the beginning. "Policy's been clear for 10 years. Marcus continued. "Women can tend homes, not civic matters. That's how we've built this settlement. And that's how we'll keep it." The other women murmured protests, but Patricia remained silent. She'd learned the value of patience. Inside the notebook she carried were her father's diagrams, calculations perfected over 3 decades of hydraulic engineering across 2 territories. Unifonda denunstier, gravity-fed irrigation systems, retention basins, terrace channels that could carry water from the northern hills to every homestead in the settlement. "Now man dat har sidan fa brudoder." Marcus had built this town from raw prairie. He'd laid out the streets, established the first wells, drawn families west with promises of good land and fair governance. For 10 years. His leadership had held them together through harsh winters and dry summers. But this summer was different. The earth itself was turning against them. "The meeting's already begun," Marcus said, stepping back to close the door. "Good evening, ladies." The heavy wooden door swung shut with finality. The lamplight disappeared. The women stood in darkness while male voices continued their ineffectual debate behind thick walls. Martha Henderson sighed and turned away. The other woman following, Patricia, remained a moment longer, studying the closed door. Then she walked home alone through streets thick with dust, past gardens where vegetables withered despite careful tending, past animal pens where cattle stood listless in the heat. Her small house sat at the settlement's eastern edge, neat and solitary. Inside, she lit a single lamp and set her father's notebook on the shelf beside his other volumes. Engineering texts, survey maps, decades of accumulated wisdom. "If they want it," she said to the empty room, "they know where to find it." She wouldn't beg. The drought would speak louder than she ever could. And when men's solutions failed, as she knew they would, perhaps then someone would remember the woman who stood outside the meeting hall holding answers. No one would hear. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night pressed close and hot, somewhere distant. Thunder rumbled without rain. August arrived like a furnace blast. The settlement woke to find the Anderson well empty. Bucket pulling up nothing but damp gravel. By week's end, 2 more wells had failed, their depths exhausted by the unrelenting heat and lack of spring snowmelt. Marcus called an emergency town meeting. Men only. Naturally, Jacob Brennan sat near the back, watching his father command the room with the same certainty he'd shown for a decade. At 24, Jacob had known no other leadership style. His father was the settlement, and the settlement was his father's vision made real. We dig deeper, Jacob suggested when Marcus asked for solutions. The Anderson well's only 30 feet. We could go to 40, maybe 50. Several men nodded. It made sense. Water had to be down there somewhere, and we ration more strictly, old Henderson added. Merchants mind calculating supplies. Half buckets per household, washing every 3 days instead of 2. The preacher raised his hand. We pray. The Lord sends rain in his time. Marcus approved all 3 measures. Jacob, organize digging crews. Henderson, draft new rationing rules. Ivern, hold services at dawn and dusk. We'll beat this drought same way we've beaten everything else. Together, and with clear heads. The meeting adjourned with renewed purpose. Men filed out talking of work schedules and prayer meetings. Jacob stayed behind, helping stack chairs, and watched his father study maps by lamplight. What if we can't dig deep enough? Jacob asked quietly. Then we dig deeper still. Marcus said without looking up. That's what men do. We don't give up. And we don't change course every time the wind shifts. At least 2 weeks later, the deeper wells yielded only mud. Rationing bred resentment as families accused each other of taking extra water. Rain didn't come despite the preacher's fervent prayers. Trobonia minor. The cattle began dying. 1 or 2 each day, collapsing in pens their owners couldn't keep adequately watered. Jacob found himself thinking about Patricia Sawyer's garden. He passed it each morning riding to the dig sites. And despite the drought, her vegetables still grew, not thriving, but surviving when everyone else's had withered. She used shade cloths, thick mulch, watered at specific times he didn't quite understand. There was method to it, knowledge applied with precision. He'd heard the older folks talk about her father, David Sawyer, the engineer who'd designed water systems across 3 territories before settling here. Patricia had been his constant companion, learning calculations and surveying, reading engineering texts by lamplight. Her late husband had been proud of her knowledge. They said, encouraged it. Late one August evening, Jacob rode to her house. She was checking her garden, adjusting a shade cloth. When he dismounted, "Evening, Mrs. Sawyer," he said, hat in hands. She straightened, a small smile touching her face. "Mr. Brennan, your father sent you to check on the widow woman." "No, ma'am. I came on my own." He gestured to her garden. How are you keeping things alive when everyone else's plots are dust?" "Knowledge," she said simply. "Are water at dawn when evaporation's lowest. Mulch thick to hold moisture. Shade cloth to reduce stress. My father taught me to work with nature, not against it." Jacob swallowed hard. "I'd say to fall. Do you really have a solution for the settlement? A real one?" Patricia studied him for a long moment. Then she went inside. Returning with the leather notebook, she opened it to careful diagrams showing channels, grades, retention points. Her father's handwriting filled the margins with calculations. "The northern hills have natural springs," she explained. "Not enough to notice in normal years, but they never fully dry. With proper grading, we could channel water by gravity to retention basins placed strategically throughout the settlement. 3 weeks of labor, maybe 4. It would save us." Jacob stared at the plans. They were brilliant, elegant in their simplicity. "My father won't listen," he said. I know, Patricia replied gently. But maybe I can make him... Jacob's jaw set with determination that surprised them both. She closed the notebook. Maybe. Mr. Brennan, but be prepared for the fight. Your father built this settlement on certain principles. Admitting he needs help from a woman, that those principles might be wrong, it'll cost him more than pride. It'll cost him his understanding of who he is. Jacob nodded slowly. The settlement's dying. Whatever it costs, it's less than that. He rode home through darkness. The image of those diagrams burning in his mind. His father sat on their porch, smoking a pipe, staring at nothing. Long ride, Marcus observed. You went to see Patricia Sawyer. Jacob said, she has a solution. Father, a real one. Engineering plans from her father. All worked out. Just needs implementation. Marcus's face hardened. We've discussed this. The wells are failing. The cattle are dying. 2 families are packing wagons. Jacob's voice stayed level. What do we do when all the men's solutions don't work? Then we find another men's solution. Marcus said, that's policy, son, has been for 10 years. Even if policy kills the settlement. Marcus stood abruptly. I know, especially then, because once you break one rule, they all fall. Once you say the policy was wrong, you're saying everything built on it was wrong. I won't do that. He went inside, leaving Jacob alone with the cricket song and the hot wind that smelled of dust and dying things. Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in darkness, memories circling like buzzards. His father's homestead, back in Missouri. Young Marcus watching everything collapse, after his father took a woman partner's advice on crop rotation. She'd seemed knowledgeable, confident. The rotation failed. Debt mounted. Bank foreclosed. His father died bitter and broken. Muttering about trust and betrayal, Marcus had learned the lesson bone deep. Men lead. Women support. Clear lines prevent chaos. When he came west at 28, he'd built this settlement on that bedrock principle. Established the Men's Council first thing. Created policies. Maintained order. It had worked. For 10 years. It had worked. His wife Sarah had never questioned it. She'd run their household with quiet competence, raised Jacob, tended her garden, and died 5 years ago without once challenging his public decisions. He'd loved her deeply. Her death had left a hole nothing could fill. So he'd filled the space with more certainty. Stricter adherence to the principles that kept chaos at bay. Now those principles faced their greatest test. September arrived with no relief. The 4th well failed on a Tuesday. Marcus called another emergency meeting, but only 15 men attended. The others were too busy preparing to leave, or too defeated to care. One more attempt, Marcus announced. We dig at the town center, deep as we can go. Spare no expense, no effort. This is our home. We don't abandon it. The men agreed half-heartedly. What else could they do? Jacob stood. Father, I'm inviting Patricia Sawyer to present her solution at the next meeting. The room went silent. Marcus felt every eye turned to him. No, he said flatly. She has engineering plans, proven methods. We need to hear them. The answer is no. Son, policy is policy. We don't break it because times are hard. That's when policy matters most. When it's tested. Jacob's voice stayed calm, but his words cut deep. Then let me ask you something, Father. What matters more? Your policy or this town's survival, because we're losing both, and only one's worth saving? The public challenge hung in the air. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. The preacher stared at his hands. Young Cooper, barely 18, watched with wide eyes. Marcus felt his authority cracking. If he bent now, he'd be admitting 10 years of error. Every meeting, every decision. Every woman he'd turned away from this hall. All wrong. The foundation of everything he'd built would crumble. The answer is no, he repeated. Each word forced through a tightening throat. Meeting adjourned. My men filed out in silence. Jacob left without looking back. Marcus stood alone in the empty hall, surrounded by chairs and tables and maps that showed nothing useful. Nothing that could save them. He locked the door and walked home through streets that felt like a graveyard. Empty houses where families had already left. Dark windows, abandoned gardens turning to weeds. Patricia heard about the confrontation from Martha Henderson, who'd heard from her husband. She sat on her porch in the evening cool, watching sunset paint the western sky. The notebook sat beside her, unopened. She'd tried 3 times now to offer her knowledge. Twice at the meeting hall door. Once through Jacob's hopeful eyes. 3 refusals. She wouldn't try a 4th. Some men had to lose everything before they'd accept help. She'd seen it before, in her father's work. Pride killed more settlements than Drought ever did. Pride and the stubborn refusal to see that wisdom had no gender. Only application. If Marcus Brennan wanted to watch his settlement die, rather than admit he'd been wrong, that was his choice. She'd survive. She always had. Her father's knowledge would keep her alive when the others fled or perished. But the thought brought no satisfaction. Only a deep, aching sadness for all the unnecessary suffering that came from one man's inability to bend. She closed the notebook and went inside. Tomorrow she'd water her garden at dawn, adjust her shade cloths, and continue surviving while the settlement around her slowly died. The cottonwood trees were nearly bare now, their leaves fallen brown and brittle. Even the hardy prairie grass was turning yellow. Nature gave warning signs to those who knew how to read them. Excluding. Marcus Brennan, for all his certainty, had never learned that language, and his ignorance was about to cost them everything. 20 men labored in the settlement's center for 7 days straight. They dug in shifts, hauling dirt in buckets, descending into the growing pit on rope ladders. 30 feet, 35, 40. Marcus worked alongside them despite his 52 years, determined to show that leadership meant shared sacrifice. His hands blistered, his back screamed, but he kept digging. This had to work. It had to. At 40 feet, Jacob's shovel struck rock, solid granite, extending in all directions. They dug the deepest well in the territory and found nothing but stone. Marcus climbed out of the pit covered in dust and defeat. The gathered crowd dispersed silently. No one spoke. What was there to say that afternoon? The Henderson family loaded their wagon. 12 people. 3 generations. Everything they owned packed tight. Old Henderson approached Marcus, hat in hand. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We've got family in Kansas. Can't watch my grandchildren die of thirst here." Marcus wanted to argue, to convince them to stay. But the words wouldn't come. He shook Henderson's hand and watched them roll away down the eastern road. By week's end, 2 more families had gone. Jacob barely spoke to his father anymore. He did his work, ate meals in silence, spent evenings elsewhere. The house felt empty despite 2 people living in it. The preacher stopped by one evening, sat with Marcus on the porch. "I've been praying on this," Reverend Thomas said carefully. Sometimes God's answers come through unexpected vessels. Maybe we should listen to Mrs. Sawyer. I need my state tree. You're right. You think God's answer is to make me look a fool? Marcus's voice was harsh. Suffered by offer. To prove 10 years of policy wrong. I think God's answer is to save this settlement. The preacher replied gently. How that makes you look seems less important than dying children. After he left, Marcus sat alone, watching nightfall across the way. Patricia's house showed lamplight in the window. Her garden remained the only green thing in the settlement. People had started asking her advice. He'd heard. She shared freely. Teaching water conservation, mulching techniques, timing strategies. Everyone sought her wisdom except the man who needed it most. But accepting it meant acknowledging his entire foundation was flawed. It meant admitting he'd excluded valuable knowledge out of fear dressed as principle. It meant facing the possibility that Sarah, his quiet wife, might have had insights he'd never heard because he'd never thought to ask. It meant becoming someone he didn't recognize. The closed meeting hall door had become a settlement landmark. Marcus noticed children daring each other to knock on it during the day. Women walked past with averted eyes. Men glanced at it with growing resentment. It represented everything failing. Everything rigid and closed and dying. Late September brought no rain. No relief. The merchant's store ran low on supplies as trade routes dried up with the settlements. The schoolhouse closed, the teacher departing for wetter regions. More families packed wagons. Marcus approved one final, desperate plan. Half the men would ride to the river 15 miles east. Establish a supply chain. Haul water back in barrels. It was logistically impossible, but it was something. Movement felt better than stillness. Even movement toward inevitable failure. They'd leave at dawn. Patricia watched preparations from her porch. Men checking harnesses, loading wagons, saying quiet goodbyes to wives and children. A week's journey there and back, if they were lucky. 2 weeks of the settlement surviving on whatever water remained in failing wells. They'd be gone when the last wells ran dry. Their families would face that crisis alone. She could stop this. One conversation, one presentation of her father's plans, and they could begin real solutions instead of desperate gestures. But Marcus had to ask. She wouldn't force wisdom on someone determined to refuse it. The notebook sat on her shelf, patient as stone. Knowledge didn't spoil or fade. It simply waited for someone wise enough to use it. Jacob found his father in the barn, checking saddles for the river expedition. The morning was gray, overcast without rain. The air thick and oppressive. We need to talk, Jacob said. Marcus didn't look up. We've said everything. No, Father. You've said everything. I haven't. Jacob's voice carried weight that made Marcus pause. Sit down, please. They sat on hay bales facing each other. Marcus saw his son clearly for the first time in weeks. The strain in his face. The adult determination that had somehow replaced boyish compliance. I love you, Jacob began. I've respected your leadership my whole life. You built something real here. Something worth protecting. He took a breath. But I'm watching you choose pride over people, and it's breaking my heart. Marcus started to protest, but Jacob raised a hand. Let me finish. Patricia Sawyer has knowledge we need. Not want. Need. She's not asking for power or position or anything except the chance to help. And you're so afraid of appearing wrong that you'd rather watch this town die than accept wisdom from a woman. It's not about appearing wrong, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what's it about? Explain it to me, because I don't understand. Jacob leaned forward. Is it really about policy, or is it about the fact that grandfather failed after trusting a woman, and you've built your entire life around never making that same mistake? The accuracy stung. Marcus looked away. That woman who advised grandfather. She might have been wrong, or unlucky, or 1,000 other things. Jacob continued. But she wasn't wrong because she was a woman. She was just wrong. And Patricia isn't her. I came down. Rekai. Once you break one rule, they all fall, Marcus said quietly. That's what you're afraid of. Isn't it not chaos? Not disorder. You're afraid that if this one policy was wrong, maybe others were too. Maybe you've been excluding valuable voices for a decade. Maybe mom had thoughts she never shared because you never asked. Marcus flinched like he'd been struck. Sarah's face flashed in memory. Her quiet acceptance. Her gentle smiles. Had she been happy or merely compliant? Had she had ideas, insights, wisdom he'd never heard? Because the structure of their life made asking impossible. Leaders serve their people, father. Jacob's voice gentled. Or they're just tyrants wearing crowns. Which one do you want to be? He stood and left Marcus alone with thoughts that wouldn't quiet. That afternoon, Martha Henderson cornered Patricia at the general store. Is it true your father designed water systems across 3 territories? Word had spread. Patricia found herself surrounded by women asking questions. How had her father learned engineering? Where were the systems he'd built? Did his methods really work? He apprenticed with the Army Corps of Engineers. Patricia explained. Studied mathematics, surveying, hydraulics. He believed water was life, and life was too precious to leave to chance. She smiled softly. He taught me everything. I was 10 when I learned to calculate gradients, 12 when I helped survey my first system. Why didn't you ever say anything? Martha asked. I did, Patricia replied gently. 3 times I tried to present to the council. 3 times I was turned away. A woman can only knock on a closed door so many times before accepting it won't open. The women were silent, anger and sadness mixing on their faces. Your husband supported you, Martha said. It wasn't a question. Thomas believed knowledge was knowledge, regardless of who held it. He was proud of my education, encouraged me to use it. Patricia's eyes grew distant. When he died, I thought perhaps I could serve the settlement with what I knew. But Marcus had his policies. And grief doesn't override 10 years of certainty. What that evening? Marcus walked the settlement's perimeter under heavy clouds. Empty pens where cattle had stood. Dead gardens. Dark windows. The physical evidence of his leadership's failure surrounded him. He'd built walls to prevent his father's chaos. But walls built to keep chaos out also kept wisdom out. And now the settlement was dying. Not from chaos, but from the rigid order that refused adaptation. Sarah's voice echoed in memory, something she'd said weeks before her death. Marcus, you're a good man, but good men can still build walls that need tearing down. Promise me you'll listen. Really listen. To the voices you've grown accustomed to ignoring. He'd promised without understanding. Now, alone under a darkening sky, he finally heard what she'd been trying to tell him. The notebook sat on Patricia's shelf, waiting. Knowledge was patient. It didn't demand or plead. It simply existed, available to those humble enough to seek it. Marcus wasn't there yet. but he was closer than he'd been that morning. The Henderson wagon rolled back into the settlement on October's first morning. They'd made it 30 miles east before realizing the futility. Kansas was experiencing its own drought. There was no refuge, no family to take them in. They'd come home to die or survive together. Marcus helped unload their belongings, shame burning in his chest. These people had left because his leadership failed them. Their return wasn't vindication. It was condemnation. There was nowhere else to go. That afternoon, he called an emergency meeting. 12 men attended. The hall that once held 30 felt cavernous and empty. The river expedition leaves at dawn, Marcus announced. We'll establish a supply chain. Barrel runs every 3 days. It'll be hard, but we can make it work. The men nodded without enthusiasm. They'd make it work because there was nothing else to make work. The alternative was surrender. After adjournment, young Cooper approached Marcus privately. My wife's expectant. Sir, baby due in 6 weeks. We need water. Real water. Not rationed drops. Maybe we should hear Mrs. Sawyer's ideas. The decision's been made, Marcus said firmly. Cooper's face hardened. Then I'm leaving. Tonight. Can't raise a baby in a dead settlement because one man's too proud to admit he might be wrong. He left without another word. Marcus stood alone in the empty hall, his reflection dim in the darkening windows. That evening, Patricia sat on her porch watching sunset paint the western sky. She heard footsteps and turned to see Marcus approaching. Hat in hands, her heart quickened. Finally, he climbed the porch steps, his face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness of soul. I'm not asking permission to speak at your meeting, she said before he could. I'm asking you, Marcus Brennan, man to man, if you'll believe that's possible. Will you look at these plans? She retrieved the notebook, held it out. He stared at it like it was a rattlesnake. I've held this line for 10 years. Patricia, he said quietly. And on if I bend now. I'm saying it was all wrong. Every meeting. Every decision. Every moment I enforced that policy. Wrong. I can't do that. I won't. His voice cracked on the last word. She saw the fear naked in his face, the terror of becoming someone he didn't recognize, of admitting that his entire foundation was sand instead of stone. I'm not asking you to say you were wrong, Marcus, she said gently. I'm asking you to say you're willing to be right from this moment forward. There's a difference. She set the notebook on the porch railing between them. It's here when you're ready, if you're ever ready. She went inside, leaving him alone with the gathering darkness and the leather-bound truth he couldn't yet accept. Ik ha zijn de decline. Marcus stared at the notebook for an hour. Mais bah. The lamplight from Patricia's window cast shadows across its cover. His hand reached for it twice, pulled back twice. Finally, he picked it up, held its weight, but he couldn't open it. Not yet. Not while his certainty still outweighed his fear, while pride still felt safer than surrender. He set it back on the railing and walked home through empty streets. The Cooper family's wagon was already gone. Disappeared into the night. Another family lost to his stubbornness. Jacob was waiting on their porch. I heard you went to see her. I did, Marcus admitted. And I'm not ready. For what? To save the settlement. To admit you're human. Jacob's frustration finally broke through. How many more families have to leave before you're ready, Father? How many more children have to go thirsty? What's the price of your pride? Marcus had no answer. He went inside, leaving his son on the porch, both of them alone in their separate darknesses. Patricia retrieved the notebook from her railing before bed. She'd tried 4 times now, 4 refusals. There wouldn't be a 5th. She'd done what she could. The rest was Marcus's choice: pride or survival, walls or wisdom, death or transformation. The settlement held its breath, waiting for a man to decide if he was strong enough to be humble. Pre-dawn darkness found Marcus in his parlor, unable to sleep, unable to rest. Everything he'd built was crumbling. And the solution sat on a widow's porch, untouched, because his hands wouldn't reach for it. Jacob's question circled endlessly. What's the price of your pride, apparently? Everything. The settlement. His relationship with his son. The respect of his community. The lives of families who'd trusted him to lead wisely. Sarah's voice whispered in memory, clearer now than it had been in years. Promise me you'll listen to the voices you've grown accustomed to ignoring. He'd ignored her. All those years of quiet competence. Had she had thoughts she never shared? Had she seen his rigidity and chosen silence over confrontation? Had he built a marriage on the same exclusionary principles that were now killing the settlement? The questions broke something inside him, not his certainty. That had already cracked. They broke his fear. The foundation fear that admitting error meant becoming his father, meant failure and ruin. But he was already failing, already ruined. The only question was whether he'd take everyone else down with him. Dawn light crept through windows. Marcus stood, body aching, soul exhausted. He walked to Patricia's house through cold October air. Breath visible. Autumn finally breaking summer's brutal grip. She was already awake, tending her garden in the gray light. She straightened when she saw him, waiting. I read it, he said simply. The lie came easier than he expected, but he would read it. That much was true. And her voice was carefully neutral. Will you come to the meeting hall today? Will you show the men? Patricia studied his face, reading things he couldn't hide. Will I be allowed through the door this time? Marcus, or will I present from the porch like a beggar? The question cut to bone. He'd made her a beggar 4 times, forced her to plead for the chance to save them. The cruelty of it struck him fully for the first time. You'll enter through the front door, he said, each word costing him pieces of who he'd been. With full standing, I'll introduce you myself. She searched his eyes, looking for sincerity, for genuine surrender. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. This afternoon, 2 o'clock, I'll need boards and chalk to illustrate the plans. I'll have them ready. He turned to go, then stopped. Patricia, I know I have no right to ask this, but why are you still willing to help after everything? She was silent for a long moment, morning light catching the silver in her hair. Because people are suffering. Because children are thirsty. Because the settlement dying doesn't prove me right. It just makes everyone wrong. She met his eye, eyeing. And because I remember when your wife was sick, you sat with her every night, reading to her, holding her hand. You loved her well. Marcus, you're capable of putting others first. You've just forgotten how. He walked home through streets beginning to stir with morning activity. The river expedition would leave in 2 hours, but it didn't matter now. There'd be no expedition. There'd be a meeting instead. And a woman's wisdom. And the beginning of something Marcus didn't yet understand, but could no longer refuse. Jacob was making coffee when Marcus entered. You look different, his son observed. I asked Patricia to present this afternoon. Full council meeting. Open to everyone. Jacob's hand froze midway to his cup. You mean it? I mean it. Will you help me set up boards in the hall? She'll need to illustrate her plans. For the first time in weeks, Jacob smiled. Not a triumphant grin, but something gentler. Relieved. I'll help. They worked side by side, father and son, preparing the hall for the wisdom they'd refused so long. Marcus found himself trembling slightly as they positioned boards at the front of the room. This was it. The moment everything changed, or everything ended. He retrieved Patricia's notebook from her porch at noon, brought it to the hall, opened it for the first time. The diagrams took his breath away. Precise. Elegant. Thoroughly considered. Her father's handwriting filled margins with calculations Marcus couldn't fully follow. But the brilliance was undeniable. This could save them. This would save them. And he'd kept it locked outside for months while his settlement died. The weight of his failure crushed down. He sank into a chair. The notebook opened before him. And for the first time in 10 years, Marcus Brennan wept. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs for all the suffering his pride had caused. All the families lost. All the pain that could have been prevented if he'd been strong enough to be humble sooner. Star. Jacob found him there an hour later. He didn't speak. Just pulled a chair close and sat with his father while the storm passed. At 2 o'clock, the hall filled. Word had spread impossibly fast. Men and women both. Children crowding near windows. The settlement that had been dying showed sudden, desperate life. Marcus stood at the front. Patricia beside him. Her calm presence steadying his shaking hands. I've held a policy for 10 years that I believed protected this settlement, he began. Voice rough but clear. I was wrong. Pride isn't protection. It's prison. And I nearly locked us all in until we died of thirst. The silence was absolute, every eye fixed on him. Patricia Sawyer has knowledge this community needs. She's tried to share it before. I wouldn't listen. His voice steadied. I'm listening now. He stepped aside, yielding the floor to wisdom he should have welcomed years ago. Patricia moved to the boards with quiet dignity. No triumph colored her movements. No vindication in her bearing. She was here to save the settlement. Not prove anyone wrong. My father was David Sawyer, hydraulic engineer, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. He believed water was life, and life too precious to leave to chance. He taught me to see land as it truly is, to read gradients and flow patterns, to work with nature instead of against it. She drew quickly. Chalk lines forming channels and basins. Anichi. The northern hills have natural springs. They never fully dry. Even in drought years. Most folks don't notice because the flow is modest, seeping through rock instead of running free. Her hand moved with practiced precision, adding elevation markers, calculating slopes. But with proper grading. We can channel that water by gravity. No pumping. No hauling. Just careful engineering and hard work. The men leaned forward, studying the diagrams. Jacob asked the first question. How many retention basins? 5, placed strategically to serve every homestead. We'll terrace gardens around each basin, maximizing efficiency. The system will provide more reliable water than our wells ever did, even in normal years. Either stay for. Materials needed, asked one of the diggers. The man who'd struck rock at 40 feet. Patricia consulted her father's notebook, Mostly lumber and stone we can quarry locally. Some metal channels for key junctions. But the general store has sufficient stock. Labor's the real requirement. 3 weeks of focused work. Maybe 4 depending on complications. I've done all this time. Old Henderson muttered. All this time the solution was right here. Patricia's eyes found Marcus briefly, then moved on. The solution was always here. Someone just had to be willing to use it. She explained retention capacity, overflow channels, seasonal adjustments. Her knowledge was comprehensive, her presentation clear. These weren't theoretical plans, but proven methods implemented successfully across multiple territories. When she finished, silence held the room. Then Jacob stood. I propose we begin tomorrow morning. All who can work, will work. We save this settlement together. Hands rose across the hall. Men and women both, united in purpose for the first time in the settlement's history. The vote was unanimous. Marcus felt something break and reform inside him. Pride shattering, and humility rising from its fragments. He stood again, every eye turning to him. One more thing, he said. Voice carrying weight of genuine change. I'm removing the meeting restriction. Permanently. All civic matters will be discussed openly. With full community participation. He paused, looking directly at Patricia. And I'm appointing Patricia Sawyer to the town council. We need her wisdom in all matters, not just emergencies. The hall erupted. Not cheers but solemn nods. Murmured agreements. The sound of a community beginning to heal. Wounds closing through acknowledged error and genuine transformation. Spy. Patricia remained still at the front, chalk dust on her hands, her father's notebook open before her. She'd waited 10 years for this moment. It had cost the settlement dearly, but perhaps the cost was the price of real change. Afterward, people crowded around her with questions about implementation, work schedules, technical details. She answered each query patiently, her knowledge flowing freely now that ears were finally open to hear it. Marcus watched from the side, seeing his settlement with new eyes. How much wisdom had he excluded? How many voices had gone unheard? The policy hadn't protected anything. It had only impoverished them all. As the crowd dispersed into evening light, planning to begin work at dawn, Marcus approached Patricia. She was packing her notebook, organizing chalk. Thank you, he said quietly. Not just for today. For not giving up on us when you had every right to. She looked at him steadily. I didn't do this for you, Marcus. I did it for the children who were thirsty, the families who were suffering. But I'm glad you finally found the courage to change. That took strength, too. A different kind than you're used to showing. He nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. I have a lot to learn. We all do. Patricia said, Why? The difference is whether we're willing to admit it. She left him in the empty hall, alone with maps and diagrams that would save them all. If he could keep surrendering his pride long enough to let transformation take root. It Benbi Chua. Tomorrow, the work would begin. Tomorrow, his settlement would start rebuilding on a new foundation. One that valued wisdom over gender, knowledge over tradition, adaptation over rigid certainty. Tonight, he could only stand in the hall he'd built and feel grateful that Patricia Sawyer had been patient enough, strong enough, to wait for his walls to finally crumble. 3 weeks of focused labor transformed the settlement. Yes, then. Men and women worked side by side, digging channels, building basins, laying stone. The northern springs proved exactly as Patricia had calculated. Water flowing steadily through carefully graded channels. Children carried tools. Elders prepared meals. Everyone contributed according to ability. The community that had been fracturing under drought found new unity and shared purpose. By early November, water flowed into the first retention basin. The crowd that gathered to watch let out a collective breath, relief and joy mixing with exhausted gratitude. It worked. Patricia's system worked. More families returned each week. Hearing news that the settlement had survived, Gesenart someway. Yeah. The Coopers came back, wife heavy with child, ready to raise their baby somewhere with a future. Gardens began revival. Carefully tended using Patricia's conservation methods. Livestock pens refilled with purchased cattle. Watered easily from the new system. Marcus found Patricia at the basin nearest her home one afternoon, checking flow rates with the same precision her father must have taught her decades ago. He'd rehearsed words all morning. But standing before her, they came out simply, "I need someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong," he said. Apparently. That's often Patricia Sawyer. "Will you marry me?" She set down her measuring stick, turned to face him fully. "Why marriage, Marcus? You've already appointed me to counsel. What more are you asking?" The directness didn't surprise him anymore. Patricia spoke truth, plainly. A quality he'd come to value deeply. "Because I'm lonely," he admitted. "Because I've built walls for 10 years, and I'm tired of living inside them. Because you're the finest mind in this settlement and the kindest heart, and I want to spend whatever years I have left learning from both." She studied him, measuring sincerity. "My first piece of advice. Then, listen to women. We've been here all along." A smile touched her lips, warm and genuine. "Yes, Marcus, I'll marry you. But understand this clearly. I'm not replacing your late wife. I'm standing beside you as a different kind of partner. Equal footing." Equal footing. He agreed, and meant it completely. They married in December, simple ceremony in the meeting hall, whose doors now stood permanently open. The entire settlement attended, packed into the space that once excluded half its population. Reverend Thomas performed the service with quiet joy, speaking of new beginnings and wisdom found through suffering. Ining san musaru. Jacob stood as his father's witness, pride evident in his bearing. The son who'd challenged his father's certainty now watched that father embrace transformation with genuine commitment. Winter passed gently. The irrigation system maintaining water supply even through freezing months. Spring arrived early, bringing rain that the retention basins caught and stored. Gardens planted in March thrived beyond anyone's memory. The combination of improved water access and Patricia's techniques yielding abundance. The town council met weekly now. 5 members instead of Marcus alone. Patricia's voice carried equal weight, her knowledge shaping decisions about expansion, agriculture, resource management. Other women joined committees, their perspectives enriching discussions that had been impoverished by exclusion. One evening in late June, Marcus stood at his fence line watching sunset paint the western sky. Patricia joined him, her presence comfortable and right, no longer separate but integrated into his life completely. Together they surveyed the settlement spreading before them, gardens lush with growth, children playing near full retention basins, the meeting hall showing lamplight through open doors where an evening session discussed fall planting. Strategies. Gateside closed. Marcus said quietly, "You opened," Patricia considered, then gently corrected. "We opened. You had to choose to step aside first. That was the hardest part. Hardest thing I ever did. Best thing, though?" He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. Best thing. And the settlement thrived under their shared governance. Families continued arriving. Drawn by news of reliable water and fair leadership, The population that had dwindled to barely 50 souls now approached 80, with more expected by year's end. Marcus learned daily humility, the strength found not in rigid control, but in openness to wisdom from unexpected sources. Patricia taught him to listen, really listen, to voices he'd spent decades ignoring. Some lessons came hard, old habits dying slowly, but he persisted. Supported by a partner who balanced firm truth with patient grace, the irrigation system became legendary across the territory. Other settlements sent delegations to study Patricia's designs, to learn conservation methods, to see what happened when knowledge was valued over tradition. She shared freely, as her father had, believing water was life and life too precious to guard jealously. On their first anniversary, Marcus and Patricia stood again at the fence line, this ritual of watching sunset together now woven into their marriage's fabric. The air smelled of growing things, water and earth and possibility. I used to think certainty was strength, Marcus said, that admitting error meant weakness. And now? Patricia asked. Now I think the strongest thing I ever did was let you through that door. He turned to her, taking her hand. Thank you for waiting on sight, for being patient enough to let me find my way. She squeezed his fingers. We found the way together. Marcus. That's what partnership means. The settlement bell rang, calling people to evening meeting. They walked together toward the hall, doors standing wide, lamplight welcoming all who wished to enter. Inside, voices rose in discussion and debate, men and women both contributing to decisions that shaped their collective future. Trestakian. The sound was richer now, fuller, like an instrument finally played with all its strings, instead of just half. Marcus took his seat at the council table. Patricia beside him, equal partners in governance, in marriage, in the ongoing work of building something worthy of the people they served. The doors stayed open. The water flowed freely, and the settlement learned, slowly but surely. That wisdom excluded is wisdom wasted. That strength comes through humility, and that the courage to change is the foundation of all real growth. Outside, stars emerged in deepening blue. Inside, the work of community continued, guided now by all the voices that had always been there, waiting only to be heard.